You should at this point see Catherine's presentation. Catherine, as I mentioned, is from UNC. We've also got BH from UNC online, and both of them have used EMF extensively and are going to be our trainers for this new software. So Catherine, take it away.
All right, thanks, Julie. Hopefully everybody is seeing the roadmap for today's webinar, the first slide in the presentation. So first thing I want to do is just sort of sketch out what we're going to be talking about today. We have quite a few webinars scheduled, so it's always good to have a plan. Let me just, there we go. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is just sort of the basics of what is the emissions modeling framework. Some of you have had a chance to install the software, so you know it's a software package, but we're going to go over some of the features that the EMF has and how we start to use it. We're going to specifically tailor this towards your inventory development efforts, and we'll talk about some of the other things the EMF can do as well. We're going to look at sort of what challenges the EMF can help solve. One of the things is we bring in this new software package, and so why? Why should we use this package? What can it do for us? Then we'll start talking about how we actually store our data in the EMF, and then some basics of how do you get started working with the EMF. Let's see, okay, here's my next slide. So first thing is just some resources for you. This first link is the EMF User's Guide. This is a web version of the guide. I know Susan sent out a Word document. I do recommend that you, from now on, use the web version. That'll be updated as we find more issues, edits. I also linked to EPA's COST website. COST stands for the Control Strategy Tool, which is part of EMF. That'll be covered in a couple of separate webinars, but we'll talk briefly about it today. I also linked to the COST User's Guide, which again, you'll be getting more into that in the COST webinars. And just to let you know, the way the user's guide, the EMF user's guide is laid out, there's a lot of screenshots in it. It's really designed to sort of help you through different tasks. So it has some background information about the different sections of the EMF, but then it's also not entirely a guided walkthrough, but a lot of screenshots of what does this button do, what does this pull-down menu do. All right, so getting started, the first thing we want to talk about is what is the EMF? So it's obviously a software package. You've been working on installing the client on your own machines, and it has several features. As you might suspect, it's named the Emissions Modeling Framework, so it's really geared at solving some of the issues, the long-standing issues that have come up in the whole process of emissions modeling. And I want to be clear, emissions modeling, we are including the inventory development. So all the way from inventory development all the way through the whole process of emissions modeling. So one of the big things that it can help you do is manage all those emissions data files. There's a lot of data files involved, and the EMF is designed to help manage that with a lot of metadata about the files. And I mentioned here it says manage emissions data files. It's not just inventories, but all kinds of different files that are used throughout the emissions modeling process. And we'll talk about some of those in just a minute. Another key feature that the EMF has is the ability to track changes to the data files. So what this means is when data is updated, when values are changed, there's a record of who did it, when it was done, and even why it was done. So if problems are found and data gets updated, there's a record of knowing when that was done. Another really big thing, and this is actually going to be the focus of our webinar in a couple weeks, is the ability to create summaries and reports from inventories. So these are called QA steps in the world of the EMF, and we'll talk in detail about that. But basically the EMF, it has all this data in its system, and then it gives you access to a lot of tools for viewing that data, summarizing the data, creating reports. Then there are some other QA tasks that we can do on inventories, things like comparing different inventories to each other, or creating annual inventories from average day values. we're going to be adding some more features for different kinds of temporalization of emissions values. And then another key thing is the ability to create controlled or future year inventories. This is part of the control strategy tool cost. And so we'll be having another set of webinars on that inventory projection and control strategies coming up in a couple weeks. So we know that the EMF is a software package, so it's good to have sort of a general view of sort of how the EMF works. Now, you've been installing the client application on your local computer. That client application, it's a Java-based application, has a graphical interface. And what that does is it communicates over the internet with the EMF server. And so Marama has set up the EMF server running out on the Amazon cloud. And the EMF server is really the workhorse of the system. The EMF server is where all of the emissions data, all the metadata is stored. It does all the number crunching in terms of when you generate reports or generate summaries. It does the work of that. The client application is pretty much for view and for you interacting with it. So that client application, it is a Java application, so it can run on Windows. It can also run on Mac OS X or Linux. One key thing is it must contact the Marama server over the internet. So if you're someplace where you don't have an internet connection, you're not going to be able to use the EMF. And as Susan was mentioning before, we have some different access restrictions in place. Currently, it is not limited to IP addresses, so we don't have to worry about that at this point. Okay, so that was a big overview of sort of what the EMF is. You don't have to worry too much about the fact that there's a server other than just recognizing that your computer is communicating with the server. It's pulling data back and forth. So now we'll talk a little bit more about what the EMF can do. So the first thing that we talked about, well, actually, this is talking about analyzing your emissions data. So we talked about how we can create different summaries of the data. So for example, we can create inventory summary reports by different source characteristics, county, SCC, plant ID, whatever codes might be in the inventory. We also have the ability to compare inventory data from one year to another year, and in fact, it's actually more flexible than that. You can even sum up inventory data and compare between sectors or across file formats, if that makes sense to do. And then we have some other types of analysis that we can do, like checking the inventory for bad values. So going through and generating a list of the unique SCC codes in an inventory. So you can look at that and see if something's missing or if there's an SCC code that you don't recognize. We can also do some analysis where we're checking for missing emissions values or negative emissions values. All of these types of analysis are called QA steps. That's what they're called in the EMF. Even though they're not specifically quality assurance, QA step is just a terminology. And so we will be covering all of this in detail in not Thursday's webinar, but the next one after that. So I've mentioned the control strategy tool, which is, we call it COST. This is built into the EMF. And basically, this has a lot of features to help you with growth and control of inventories. So we have the ability to apply growth factors to create future year inventories. And Marama is developing growth factors that are going to allow any combination of base and future years all the way out to 2030. So between those growth factors and the abilities of cost, you'll be able to take your base year inventories and grow them to whichever future year you need to do your analysis on. The cost tool can also help with control strategy, so estimating the reductions and engineering costs associated with control strategies. It has a variety of algorithms for deciding which control strategies to apply, and then can give you a report of the overall costs and the emissions reductions. And then we also have the ability to apply control measures to create the controlled inventories. So we can both grow inventories to a future year, and we can apply control factors to create the controlled inventories. And we will be covering cost in detail in a set of 3 webinars, which I think will be in about a month from now. So there's another aspect of the EMF that really gets more into the emissions modeling side of things, and that's that the EMF can manage all the inputs and the settings that are needed for running emissions modeling tools like SMOKE, the smoke emissions modeling system. And so just as a brief overview, SMOKE handles taking the emissions inventory data and converts it into the air quality model inputs by applying allocation factor data. And we're not going to be covering this topic at this point because it's not super relevant to the kind of work that Marama is targeting. I do want to mention this aspect of the EMF because you will see data in the EMF more geared at this phase of emissions modeling. So you'll see things in the EMF like gridding surrogates, which are used to convert the emissions inventory into gridded data. Also, the EMF is moving to incorporate more of these emissions modeling functions directly in it. So for example, some of the updates will be looking at temporalizing the emissions inventory data. So taking emissions inventory data and converting it to different time scales. For air quality modeling, that time scale is hourly, but for other kinds of inventory analysis, you might want to get daily values or monthly values for comparison purposes. And so a lot of the logic is very similar there in terms of how do we allocate our annual or seasonal values into the time scale that we're interested in. So this general aspect of the EMF for managing the inputs and settings to run SMOKE is called case management. And so again, we're not really going to be covering that, but I do want to bring it up just because there will be some things you see in the EMF that are related to case management. And so I'm just bringing it up so that you have a little bit of a remembering that, oh, that's what that's for. That's for handling running SMOKE. So generally, we've talked about what the EMF can do for you, things like managing your data, giving you a way to analyze your data, analyze your emissions inventory, also with the cost, being able to grow your emissions inventory and do controls. So now we want to talk about sort of what problems can the EMF help us solve. And a big one is just file organization. There are a lot of files to manage for projects, especially when you get into these inventories where you can have month-specific files, daily, maybe even hourly data files. So, if you have month files, maybe you've got 12 different months for a particular sector. Just keeping track of all of those can get messy. Also, how do you make the data available to other people? How can you find what you need? Do you need to go to a website? Do you need to go to an FTP site? Where do you find the data that you're looking for? Then when we have that data, how do we track the changes to it? If something gets changed, if something gets updated, how do we find out about it? Who made the change? Why did they make that change? And then a big one, when we make updates, how do we make sure we're using the latest version of the data? I know personally I've searched back through emails to find that one spreadsheet that's been sent to me by somebody, and it's like, is this the latest version? Am I sure I have the latest version? All of these are kinds of problems that by having a central system like the EMF, we can have all the data in one place and have one place where we go to find the data that we're looking for. And again, getting back, more problems. How do we share information? Not just the data itself, but information about the data. Like, oh, I ran a county summary report and I found something odd in this file. Why are my emissions for this county low? What's going on with it? So if you find problems, how do you ask questions? If you have questions, how do other people later on find out about it? Can they review your conversations? Another big thing is, how do we ensure that any output we create is reproducible? So if you're looking at a summary, and what version of the inventory was that summary created from? That's a big thing, is if there were changes made, how do you know the report that you're looking at? When did we create that? Can we reproduce it if we need to? And then another thing is, how do we keep track of what analysis or quality assurance have already been done on a particular file? Why duplicate work? If somebody else has already created something that's exactly what you need, maybe you can use that, or maybe you can start as give that as the starting point. Again, it's all about sharing information. Okay, so at this point, we were going to have a little poll, and I see a note from Julie that perhaps the poll software is not working at this right now.
Let me go ahead and give it a try, and let's see if we can make it work.
Okay.
Well, that looks promising. Do folks have do you have a radio button next to it? Maybe not, huh? I think what happened is we tested this poll before the webinar started, and it closed it as a result. So you want to just walk through that and explain what the right answer is, Catherine, and then the next poll should work much better.
Okay, sure, no problem. So these polls are just sort of keep you on your toes a little bit, see if you're awake out there. Basically, this first one is just sort of recapping what things did we talk about the EMF being able to do. So the question is, which of these is something that the EMF can't do? So we have keep track of all the emissions inventories for a project. That we talked about. Yep, we can do that. Create a summary of an inventory by county or SEC code. Yep, we can do that. We can create summaries by lots of different pieces of information. Project an inventory from 2011 to 2030. Yep, that's something that the cost tool can do. And then we get to the last one. Send an email to other users when you import a new inventory. That's the one that right now the EMF doesn't have notification options like that. That's something that could be added in the future if it seems useful, like as different groups collaborate. How do we notify other users of changes? Perhaps email would be useful. Given that this is a government project, I rather doubt that like Facebook or Twitter integration, we're probably not going to get into the social network sharing or anything like that. So the answer is D.
Okay, thanks. I'll go ahead and hide it, and then you can move on.
Okay. And we should be back. So we've talked generally about what the EMF is, what it can do. So now we want to get into some of the guts of what is inside the EMF. This is information that you're going to have to know to be able to work with the interface effectively. So the first thing I want to talk about is how is data stored in the EMF. So we talked about that the EMF can manage all your files for you, and it can create all of these summaries. So the way that this works is that data files, so these are your actual inventory files, your text files on disk, they get imported into the EMF, and they're called data sets in the EMF. So all throughout the EMF, you will see the word data set, because that is the actual, that's the data, that's what we refer to, that's what a data set is. So during the import process, the EMF is going to read the raw data from the file, and then it's going to put it into a database on the EMF server. So it's actually reading all of the values out of the file and storing it into a database, which is how then later it can do things like tracking your edits or allowing you to create summaries, because all of that data is loaded into a relational database. Now, an important concept related to data sets is their data set type. So when you import a file, you have to tell the EMF what data set type to use. And the data set type defines both the kind of file that it is, whether it's an inventory file versus some sort of cross-reference file or allocation factors file, and it also defines the exact type of the file in terms of the format, like the column names, what kind of data is in each column, whether it's a string or an integer. Also, when it reads the data in, it needs to exactly match that format. So the data set types will be very specific to each file format. So, for example, the flat file 2010 data format for point sources is different than the flat file 2010 format for non-point sources, because we have two different pieces. There's different data inside there. So inside the EMF, those would be different data set types. Now, the nice thing is the data set types are all configurable in the EMF. So some users within the EMF system will be administrative users, and those administrative users have extra privileges. And one of those extra privileges is the ability to create these data set types. So you can, the administrators can go in and define new data set types by defining the file format. So the great thing about this is if a new file format comes along, the administrator can create a new data set type and suddenly the EMF can work with it. It doesn't require a software update to be able to handle new data set types. So that's generally, so the general process is we import a file, the data gets read in, and we create a data set in the EMF. And we'll talk more about what else besides the data is part of the data set. But every data set has its data set type. And the data set type is just an indicator of the format of the data that it was originally imported from. So next we're going to talk about the different kinds of data that the EMF can manage. So the big one that you guys are probably most interested in is the emissions inventories themselves. And so this, of course, is the measured or estimated emissions by source. And these emissions data can have different temporal resolutions. You might have annual data or finer level stuff, monthly, daily, seasonal. This data can be base year emissions, future year emissions, controlled emissions. Those would all be considered different data sets within the EMF. And I should mention emissions inventories, obviously those are emissions. The EMF can also handle activity inventories. So if you have on-road mobile activity data like vehicle miles traveled or speed data, that's going to be another data set type within the system, but the EMF can load that in and manage it for you. So the EMF can read several different emissions inventory file formats, and in just a second I'll show you just a handful of those. And then, as I mentioned, the data set types are specific to the inventory format, so the EMF knows about the different types of emission sources. So it understands on-road mobile versus non-road versus non-point and point. And again, remember this reading process, this is where we're reading the data and storing it into the database. So that's the import-read process. So just a smattering of the different data set types that the EMF has. And again, these are examples taken from the Marama EMF server. Because the EMF is flexible, because the administrators can define their own data set types, it's possible that there'll be new types come along, or if there's types that nobody uses, they can be removed if they're just cluttering up the system. So these names, I'm giving you them as examples. These would probably be the typical ones you'll be working with, but it can change in the future. I should mention that there's a section in the user's guide that has a bigger list of common data set types. So it lists the name of the data set type in the EMF and then describes what type of data that is, and then also has links to the specific file formats that go with that data set type. So these data set types that I'm showing here, I used a little syntax just to kind of make the slide a little shorter for you. Basically, there'd be a data set type called flat file 2010 non-point. And so that is a data set type that's going to correspond to the annual or month-specific emissions for non-point in FF10 format. There'll be another one, FF10 or flat file 2010 point, 2010 activity. There's also two different types for the flat file 2010 non-point daily, both the non-point daily and the point daily, which would give you your day-specific inventories. And then just as an example, ORL is another inventory format. It's slightly older. I think everything's moving towards flat file, towards the FF10 format now. But the EMF can load in those ORL formats as well, and it understands all the different sectors. So fire sector, for example, or the on-road sector. So we talked about the big one, emissions inventory data. The EMF is very flexible in its data management, and so some of the other types of data you might run into are these allocation factors. And again, these are the factors we use to take the emissions estimates, or the measured emissions, the emissions inventory, and calculate the gridded data, the hourly speciated data that's needed for air quality models, or other purposes. There might be other reasons you might use the allocation factors. And again, I'm covering this just because you're going to see it in the EMF, and this may be relevant to different parts of the work you need to do. So we have things like the gridding surrogates, which are the factors where we allocate the county level emissions out to grid cells. We have the speciation profiles, which is how we convert emissions that are by pollutant in the inventory into the specific species of the chemical mechanism that's going to be needed by the air quality model. And then we have temporal profiles, which help to convert whatever temporal resolution of the emissions inventory we have into hourly emissions for air quality modeling, but you'd have other factors to do estimates to different levels of temporal allocation. And I just want to mention, in addition to those allocation factors, there are a whole set of cross-reference files which are used to assign the allocation factors to the sources in the inventory. So you'll see those in the EMF as well. So then we also have the data that's needed by cost to generate our grown or controlled inventories and to do our control strategy analysis. So we have things like the growth factors, which again, Marama's developing a whole set of those to handle all kinds of different years. And then we have the control measures, where we model our control technologies. So those control measures would have things like the effectiveness information for the control technology, and then also the factors to calculate the engineering costs. And again, we will be getting into growth and control in a lot more detail when we move into the cost webinars. And just a real quick, there is one other important kind of data that the EMF manages, which is all this reference data. So your inventories have codes. For humans, sometimes the codes aren't as nice. We'd rather have names, like state and county names. Another thing that EMF can do is we have a database that stores the county latitude and longitude coordinates, so then those can be included in your reports. So then you can take those reports and take them into different GIS tools or into Google Earth, for example. And then we also have names for other codes like SCC descriptions, SIC MACT, NAICS, all kinds of different description codes. And mostly those are used, again, in building your reports so that we can have names instead of just codes. Okay, so now we're going to do poll number 2, which I think Julie will put up on screen.
Yeah, folks will go ahead and just try to recall what has been said. We talked about several kinds of data. What didn't we discuss so far? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll then, and you'll see the results. All right, Catherine, take it away.
Okay, I can't actually see the results.
Oh, you can't see the results. Well, then let me describe them. It says we talked
Okay.
about several different kinds of data, and which one didn't we discuss? Most people said hourly temperature data.
Excellent.
Okay, good. All right, so you did discuss then seasonal point source emissions, factors to estimate gridded from county level emissions, and control measure efficiencies, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So now we're back. And I should mention, we didn't specifically talk about hourly temperature data. It turns out that, generally with that meteorology data, we use a binary format for storing it. And the EMF can actually handle some of that data. It doesn't tend to import it into its database. It does what we call, it's an external data set type, but it can manage metadata about it. But we are not going to worry about that because I don't think that that's really going to be relevant to the kinds of work that you guys will be doing. All right, well, enough of that talk. Now let's actually see some pictures of what the EMF looks like. So for those of you who made it through the process and have gotten the EMF launched, you've probably seen the login box. And so each time you launch the EMF client, you'll need to log in, and everybody should have their own username and password. And the reason for that is just so that we can keep track of what you did in terms of what data edits you've made or notes that you've made. Everything will be logged by your username. The first time you started it up, if you haven't done this, you'll need to create your username and password and enter your profile information. And we're just letting everybody pick their own username. The EMF will require them to be unique. So if you try to pick one that somebody else has, it'll let you know.
Excuse me, Catherine.
Yeah.
Can I just get in here? Because there's a couple questions that it might help people to get answered right off. Do you mind if I just break a couple questions here?
Sure, no problem.
Okay, so first, can you just describe what is a flat file in more common terms, like Excel files, Access files, maybe make some analogies to those?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the flat file 2010 format, it's a text-based format, and basically I think it's a comma-separated value, a CSV format, actually. And so each line of the inventory has the source description. So the FIPS code, the SEC, if it's a point source, then it would have all the plant characteristics. And then each line is a particular source and a particular pollutant. And then it has the emissions values for that source and pollutant, the annual emissions or monthly emissions. And so those formats, again, they're just text-based, nothing binary here. And so they're just basically spreadsheets where each column is just either the source characteristics or the pollutant information, or there's a ton of information that can be in those files.
Catherine, is there any information on what those are in the user's manual, or could we possibly just send a short description of each of the data items to the group after this call?
Yeah, the user's manual, in fact, it's in chapter 3 in the common data set type section. It has links to the format of all of the files. So you can actually go, they link over to the smoke documentation because that's the best way I had to link to it. But it'll show you the format of those files. And basically, it's just a description of what each column is.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I think I was thinking of. Judy, if that doesn't answer your question, please put in another question in the box. Here's another question. I downloaded a file on FF10 format, which included EIS identifiers. Are these codes locked with the FF10 format, or can the date be updated to be consistent with EIS independent of flat file format? I'm not sure I understand that question. Do you understand it, Catherine, or maybe we should ask Steve to clarify?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I think the EIS things are part of EPA's process, so yeah, okay. I'm not.
Let me just unmute Steve, and maybe he could clarify briefly. Steve, what were you trying to get out there? I have unmuted you.
Oh, well, I downloaded because, like you said, CSV file and all that stuff, and I looked for the specification, and I found it a smoke flat file format, April 2026, 2010, no events. And it had all the formats, but it also had EIS codes and pollutant codes and everything else. And I wondered if that was just there as information, or whether or not the FF10 locks in, these are the pollutant codes and these are the different things you can use, and that's FF10, or whether or not FF10 is just the CSV type files in that, the CSV formats in that, and that the lookups can be managed in EMF to stay consistent with EIS and still be FF10 format.
Yeah, as far as I know, the FF10 format is just strictly, here's what we interpret each column as. The EMF does have built in some databases of how does it know what pollutant maps to what name, but I don't think that's part of the FF10 format itself. So I think those codes are, user definable. It's just a matter of whether you'll have descriptions and whatnot into the EMF system or not. But if EPA
in EMF, or is that something the administrator would control in EMF, or that the pollutant lookup and those lookups, are those something that
Yeah, I'm not actually sure about that. So that would be something I'll make a note to check in about that one. Exactly how that.
With these questions about flat file 10, we might need to branch out and get EPA to get on and give us some background on flat file 10. If you guys think that's a good idea, you could just go ahead and indicate that in the question box, and I'll follow through and get that for you. So thanks, Steve, and we'll try to follow up on your question there. There was one more hand raised. That was Andy Bodnarik. Let me unmute you. Andy, you're unmuted. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
I was just wondering if you were going to explain more of the flat file 10 stuff, and it sounds like you are.
Okay, all right. So this really confirms it, that we probably need to get some follow-up on flat file 10. So thanks, Andy. Okay, good. You want to go ahead, Catherine, and continue on? Those were the questions I thought it would be worth getting out there before you got too much further on. So go ahead.
Yeah, and to be clear, I am not super familiar with the whole inventory development process. So again, this would be something where, EPA is moving to this flat file, the FF10 format. So I think that's probably better directed at them in terms of getting more information about sort of how that gets set up and the meanings of everything. Okay, so we talked about logging in. Each time you'll log in, you create your account. And then if everything goes properly, this is the main EMF window that you'll see. And at this point, I am just going to switch quickly over into my EMF that I'm running. I should be clear, this is a version of the EMF that I'm running all local. So this is not actually the Marama server, but it'll look very, very similar. And so just a quick orientation for you. This is your standard, graphical interface sort of thing. We've got some menus up at the top, and in the user's manual, those will be referred to as main menu, so file menu, manage menu. Just a couple things to show you quick, and again, you're going to have a little homework exercise where you're going to get more familiar with some of this stuff. So this is just really quick orientation. Manage data sets is going to be the big thing, and you'll be working with this in the homework. This is how we get in and start working with our data sets. A few other things of interest right now. This My Profile will open up a profile editing window. So if you do need to change a password or you need to change any of your profile information, that's where you would do it. There's a couple of windows that are a little bit important to show you, and those will actually be on the next slide, but I'm going to just, we'll talk about this status window and the downloads window briefly. And then the other thing I want to mention, this window menu, you can end up with a lot of windows on your screen if you have a lot of data sets open, and so this window menu will always show you all of the windows you have open. I only have one right now, but if I had multiple windows open, for example, then now I've suddenly got a lot of windows, and so the Windows menu will help you get around a little bit. And again, as you play with it, you'll get the feel for it, and hopefully it'll be pretty intuitive. Okay, so let me switch back to my slideshow. So just briefly here, we talked about how the EMF is a server client system. So you're running the client on your local machine and the server is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the background. And so the way that this works is as you do things, this status window is going to give you your information about the tasks that are going on. So if you start a long-running task, like importing a file, exporting a large file, basically the client will tell the server to get started, and then the server will do its work, and your status window will be updating itself, and that'll tell you when your status is complete. So that's how you can see sort of what's going on to find out where you are and things. And then there's also a downloads window, and so when you are downloading files, like you're exporting a data file or you're downloading the results of an analysis or something, those will show up in your downloads window. And again, that's for if it's a very large file, then it just takes it a little while. And so the downloads window has a progress bar to just show you what's going on with your download. Okay. So I briefly pulled up the data set manager from the manage. I went to the manage menu and I selected data sets. And so we talked about data sets. All the files get imported into the EMF and they get created as data sets. So the data set manager is where you end up being able to see all your data sets and start working with them. So because this is a server system, every time you load data in, it needs to contact the server to pull the data back. So when you first launch the dataset manager, by default it doesn't show you anything because it doesn't know what to pull back. And there could be potentially thousands of data sets loaded into your system. And so waiting for it to pull all of that back before you even had a chance to tell it what you're looking for would be kind of a waste. So initially when you open that window, you won't see any options. And there's a very easy way to get to things, which is a pull-down menu for showing the data sets by type. So if I go on to this next window, this is just a screenshot of the data set manager. I should note this is not from the Marama server, so the list of data sets will be different when you get on the Marama server, but the layout is exactly the same. And so the big thing is, I was mentioning this show data sets of type. So in this case, we've used the pull-down menu, and we're showing all of our ORL point inventory files. Today's homework is going to walk you through a lot of the features of this data set manager. So rather than me pointing things out, I think it works best for you to sit there yourself and see what the different features are. But basically, you're going to learn a little bit about what these toolbar buttons do. You're going to get to play with these options here. It'll be the next webinar where we're really going to dive into all of these different pieces of data about data sets. There's a lot of data that the EMF stores about the data sets. And so after you have a little chance to play around with it, then in our next webinar, we'll be talking more in detail about that. So I think this is mostly just what I just mentioned, that the dataset manager is basically, it lists every dataset that's imported into the system, and then it displays a summary of information about each one. So that's really your main location, where to find a dataset to start working on it. Whether working on it means you need to make edits to it, you need to export it, or you want to do some kind of analysis on it, you're always probably going to start with the dataset manager. And as I mentioned, you do have a little homework assignment. We talked about how Marama is running their EMF server on the Amazon cloud. Right now that server is running and it's not restricted by IP address, so you should be able to connect to it. In the future, there will be a scheduled set of times for availability because because of the way the cost structure works, I don't think that they'll be running the server constantly, but I'll let Susan or Julie, once they work out a policy on that, then that'll be communicated. And Julie, had you sent out the link to the homework yet?
I don't think I have done that yet, but can you show what's in there on the screen, on your screen? Do you have that file open?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. I was going to do that.
So I can send the link. I can go ahead and send the link after this call so that people can pull it.
Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the window with the webinar 1A homework. And so Julie's going to send out the link. This homework, for reference, I included a link to the user's guide. And then basically what this is going to do is it's going to take you through step-by-step sort of how do I get into the EMF in terms of opening the dataset manager, how do I find different data sets. It's going to walk you through learning how to use the system a little bit. And then scattered throughout, you'll see these little questions. And so these are things where you will find the answer to them using the EMF, and then you can click the Show Answer button to show the answer. If you want to cheat, you can show the answers right away. This is really for you guys to have a little, experience doing some things on the EMF. And yeah, and then there's a few little exercises at the bottom. So, and that is the end of webinar 1A.
Okay. So are there questions that folks have that have come up now? One question. Here's a couple questions from Steve, and I'll just read them off. Can a user download a data set that is locked because it is being edited? The user manual indicates that a user can view it but not edit a locked data set. Can you talk about that, Catherine?
Yeah, so we'll talk about this viewing and editing problem coming up. But yeah, basically only one user can edit a data set at a time. I don't actually know the answer on exporting. I honestly, I don't know that answer. My gut reaction is yes, because you can view it. I figure you should be able to export it. But we can certainly, try that out and see if that works or not.
Okay, so Steve, we'll get back to you on that, but likely the answer is yes. And then the other question is there a timeout on a user connection such that an unintended connection is terminated? And I don't know, did Susan McCusker, can you answer that? I'm not really sure.
I haven't had it happen to me yet, but there could possibly be a threshold over which it would be terminated.
Yeah, sorry, we're sort of just getting started ourselves using this, and so we don't have all the answers all the time. Another thing that we just learned is, I heard from Carla that Maine was able to get onto the EMF, so good job, Susan. It seems like the new access is working out well. And then another person mentioned that they had difficulty because they were asked to sign on to the UNC website, obtain a user password and so forth. And I think BH, you managed that and handled that. Apparently the links that you provided should not require a sign-on. Is that right?
No, you do not need any sign-in. It's just a full path of link that you need to copy or click or copy it into your web browser. It will automatically download it into your computer.
Okay.
And I would mention, I was going to say, I would really recommend from now on everybody use the HTML version of the manual rather than the Word document, because updates will get made to the HTML version, whereas the Word document may not get updated. So just to let people know.
Your voice dropped out there a minute. You said the HTML, right? The online version, right? That's what people
say. Right. Recommended people use the online version because that'll always be up to date.
Right, okay. And then
the document,
go ahead.
Julie, I just wanted to say the Word document version will be updated as well, but it will be the later when we finish all the updates are done, then we'll finally release the final version. But HTML is more like living document that will fix it on the go. So.
Right. Okay. So it will be the first to be updated. All right, so here's a question about the database that is being used by the EMF server. What is that relational database?
Oh, yeah, that's a Postgres database. So it runs on the EMF server, and yep, it's Postgres.
Okay, and here's another question. Can you edit data sets online, or do you have to download the data set, edit it, and then resubmit the entire data set?
No, you can edit it online. In fact, that's a big part of the EMF is that there's a whole integrated editor where you can bring up the data set, you can use some find and replace options, you can use some filtering options to narrow down to find where you want it. And yeah, in fact, I don't know that you could I don't think the EMF would be able to track if you downloaded the file and imported it again. We'll talk about this next time, the concept of versions of a data set. But yeah, the EMF is geared at you making the edits online.
Okay, and Susan McCusker, would it probably, if you submitted it, probably come in as a new data set? Is that right, Susan?
I'm not sure how it would handle it, because if it would try to give it the same name, we could possibly try that to see how it reacts, but I think that it would give you some kind of a flag.
Yeah, it would need to be a new data set, which probably would not be the intended behavior.
Okay, great. And then here's a question. Does EMF editing essentially remove the need for growth and control packets on inventories in smoke?
Yeah, the cost tool, in fact, EPA does all of its growth and controls outside of smoke at this point. They use the cost tool to do it.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? Okay. You're quite welcome, Tim. Let's see. Can other states see other states' data? I think the answer is yes. Let's see. Maybe Susan McCusker is probably the best to answer that. I guess the question is, can you hide your state from other states?
I have not encountered that ability yet, so from what I've seen so far, what's on there is visible to any user. But if I encounter otherwise, then I will let everyone know.
Okay.
I think that each user has the ability to show or hide certain data set types. I don't think that that is set by the administrator.
Okay.
And that would just be by type, not by specific name.
I think the intention, though, of this system is to do what we've been doing kind of more manually via our FTP, which is to share our inventories with each other so that people have complete data sets that they can use in analysis or modeling or whatever. So I think that my preliminary thought would be that that's not the intention of what we're trying to put together here. Ken Sentwell, I've unmuted you. You had your hand up. Do you have a question there? You might be muted, Ken, on your own machine. You're unmuted on my system, and if you have the opportunity to take your mute button up, you can go ahead and ask a question. Otherwise, go ahead and type it in. Okay, and then I had a couple other items, and that is I did hear back from some folks that some more background on FF10 would be helpful. So I will approach EPA about trying to get a session in here about flat file 10. And then another item that came in was that March 4th is a problem. I think I mentioned this before, and I'll try to think about how to handle this. I might just do a doodle where I put all the dates out that we have here set aside, in addition some other dates and try to figure out if we have a problem. We do want to try to get everybody to see all the webinars if at all possible. There are, at this point, 44 of you on the line, so it might be tricky to get a date that absolutely everybody can make. But if there are ones that we've already got problems with, I would like to know about that. So kind of look for, I'll try to think about how to handle it. I mean, my first thought is to use a doodle poll, so watch for that. And then here's a question from Laura about what is the maximum amount of data that the EMF server can hold? Catherine, do you have a sense of that? I know that EPA has got gigabytes and gigabytes.
Yeah. I mean, it can be truly massive. Now, I know in the case of Marama, since it's running on the Amazon cloud, there will be issues about the cost involved if the thing gets really large. But as far as I know, the EMF itself doesn't really limit you. It's just a matter of how much disk space you want to give over to the database.
Right. And we're not even close to even the minimum on Amazon at this point. Susan, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
We are fine on Amazon, and we can expand the amount of space that we have if we need to. So it's my understanding that we should be fine on there, and like Catherine mentioned, it would just be a matter of the cost.
Okay, and then Jen actually asked what files have already been loaded onto the Amazon cloud. And actually, you'll see that when you do your homework, you'll actually see what files are there. But did you want to give a little summary of that, Susan?
At this point, I've imported all of the Marama 2007 inventory and some of the NEI files. I think it was NEI non-point, and also some of the responsible agency selection files, which I understand are similar to the NEI files. But that's what's on there for now, and we're still in the process of importing. So let us know if there's something that you're looking for and it's not there, and we can work together to get in all the files that we need.
Julie,
Okay,
can I make a quick comment on the data size of the files?
Sure, go ahead.
So even EPA does not import any daily or hourly inventory data into EMF server. They treat it as an external data set. So that's something you guys keep that in your mind, that you can always treat it as an external data set and import it later if you need to, but you don't necessarily have to put it in your database.
Right, so some of you may be aware that our ERTAC EGU is hourly, but for the purposes of EMF, we're going to summarize it up to daily so that it can be more readily handled in the database. But obviously for modeling, we would continue to use the hourly file. But for analysis, I think daily should be adequate to manage that particular data type. Okay, here's a question. Will EPA modeling inventory be imported into this Marama site? Yes, Roger, it will. Are there any more questions? We'll just give it another minute if something comes to mind. So thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you later.